Hey guys, what's going on? In the next series of videos, we're going to start going through the presence sliders down here. And the thing you want to keep in mind right off the bat as we start to go through these is that less is more. Now, I know I've said in the past that everything here is really subjective. This is art we're dealing with. You might like some of these effects pushed up to their max. But for me personally, the images that I tend to create or try to create, I really feel like less is more with these sliders. Using just a little bit can really go a long way in my view. So in this video, we're going to talk about specifically the texture and clarity sliders. So what these are, and they're pretty similar. How you want to think of these is that they both kind of do the same thing, but the texture slider is like the baby brother of the clarity slider. The clarity slider really gives you that bigger, more punchy effect, and the texture slider is a little bit more subdued. So just as an example, you can kind of see what this does here in this photo. And I've left all of our edits from the past video that we did with the tone sliders. So now we're just going to be adding these presence effects to these photos. So let's start by just cranking the clarity slider up, and you can see what it does. You can see it adds more contrast. It kind of sharpens the edges a little bit. And if you're watching the histogram at the top, you can see it kind of pushes some of those darker tones a little bit more dark. So it has a greater effect on the tonal ranges of your photo than the texture slider does. You can see it creates, you can really notice this in the clouds too. The clouds get a little bit more punchy. They get a little bit more defined, where texture, you start to bring that up a bit, you can see it is way more subtle. And it's actually probably best seen if you look down here in the city. So maybe I'll zoom in a little bit. You can see these buildings here. Start to turn clarity up. You can see it kind of adds some contrast. It darkens some of the darker tones a bit more, and it defines the edges a little bit of those buildings. And then texture, you can see it's a bit more subtle. Now, texture is kind of a newer slider that Adobe added to Lightroom, and it kind of solves some of the problems that clarity had. It's just a little bit more subtle. It's better for skin tones. So, for example, usually if you're taking a portrait of someone, you don't really want to crank this clarity slider up, or even the texture slider for that matter, because it'll really just accentuate their pores in their skin and any kind of and any kind of imperfections they might have. So for skin and for portraits, what people tend to do is they tend to drag these to the left a little bit, and you can see when you go in the opposite direction, it sort of has the opposite effect. It just softens things a little bit. And by dragging this texture slider left on a portrait, for example, which I'll get into in a minute, it can create some pleasing skin tones. Whereas clarity, if you drag that to the left, it really you can see it kind of muddies the photo a little bit. And if you did this with someone's skin, it just wouldn't look as good. It would look kind of muddy. So with texture, it allows you to soften some things, soften skin without losing as much detail and without as affecting the tones a bit. You can see if I go left and you pay attention to the histogram up here, it doesn't have as big of an impact on that as clarity does. You can see it really pushes those tones over to the left. So it kind of creates a pop. It adds a little bit of a crunch, and it gives a little bit more, definition to the photo. I like using clarity a little bit more for landscapes. And so in this example, I might drag it just like a little bit to the right. And you can see it just adds just a little bit more pop, a little bit more definition to the edges. And, you can even use these in conjunction with each other. So maybe you want to give it just a little bit of texture and clarity. And for me, for my taste, that's pretty much it. That's all that I would do with this one. So I'm going to do what I did in the last video and just go through some of these examples here. So for this one, I think by default it looks a little bit soft. So I think adding a little little clarity to the photo. You can see just sort of makes the details and the buildings pop just a little bit, defines the edges a bit more. So I might push this one up a little bit, maybe into this range. You can also, you know, see what texture does. It's just a little bit more subtle. And you know, you might prefer this, but you know, for my landscapes, I like to use a little bit of clarity. So I'll go about here. I think looks pretty good. So this one, I think, again, I think I might use a little bit more clarity. You can really see what it does to the cat's hair here. Maybe if I show you texture a little bit, it's a little bit more subtle, but with clarity, really just gets a little punchy, and you can see it impacts more of the outer parts of the photo as well. So I really think going maybe like about here kind of gives it a little bit of sharpening, a little bit of contrast. Just gives it that punch. So here's our black and white, and I think really pushing clarity on a black and white landscape is pretty cool, especially when you have these details like these rocks here. I might use a little bit more clarity in this one. And you can see how texture looks, just a little bit more subtle, but I like clarity here. And I realize in our last video, we didn't really do any portraits at all. All of my examples were landscapes. So I brought in a portrait here. So we're going to start with Adobe Standard. And this is a raw photo right out of the camera. No other edits have been made here so far. So I think in terms of exposure, you know, and this was more of a studio type shot where I had a soft box and some off-camera lighting. So the exposure was pretty much nailed in camera, so there isn't much to change here. I might bring the blacks in a little bit, maybe take some of the highlights down, make the face a little bit less blown out. Maybe bring the shadows up just a hair, but really there isn't much we need to do here with these sliders. Now, as I mentioned before, you can see the skin definition here. You can see the pores on the skin. You don't really want to add clarity to that. You can see it just really, you know, and maybe you do. Maybe you like that sort of really crunchy. You can see what happens when we turn it way up to the right. You get that really crunchy, grungy type look. You know, not really what I'm going for, but texture-wise, and you know, just to talk, as we go through these sliders here in these videos, we're really applying these to the entire photo. In the next series of videos, once I get through the presents, I'm going to start going through these tools up here where you can make targeted adjustments to your photos. So maybe you only want to apply this definition, this texture to the hair. You know, you might want to turn that up a little bit to give the hair a little bit more definition in the fabric here. But in the skin tone, in a portrait, you might want to soften it a little bit. And you can see it really gives a nice softening to the skin, but it still keeps some of the details there. You can still see the pores. Where if I turn the clarity down, it's like the same way. It's just a little bit more, you kind of lose some of the color up in here in the eye. It just starts to get muddy. And I think just a little texture down on a portrait can really soften the skin, and you can see just get that soft look, and that might even be too much, but I think something like this is probably what I would do. And again, in this example, we're just giving the slider, you know, the entire photo, the treatment that we're using with the slider here. If this were a real portrait retouch, I would probably be using the adjustment brush and making these targeted adjustments to certain areas. But right now, when we turn the texture down, we're softening the entire photo, and even these parts that I probably wouldn't necessarily want to be soft. So that's just an example of a portrait and how texture and clarity are used. In the next video, we're going to go through the dehaze slider, and then we'll wrap up this present section with the vibrance and saturation before we move on to these more targeted tools up here. So thanks for watching. Please hit the like and subscribe button. I really appreciate it if you share these videos on social media. Leave comments. If If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thanks for watching, and take care. See you guys in the next one. Cheers.